This video is brought to you by Nebula. Last Tuesday, Iran fired a barrage of ballistic missiles at Israel, its largest ever attack on its regional foe. Unfortunately for the Ayatollahs, if these were intended to deter future Israeli action, as Iranian officials claim, they've apparently failed. They were largely thwarted by Israel's air defense systems, and at the time of writing, Israel is considering deciding whether to retaliate against Iran's oil facilities or go straight for its nuclear facilities. This speaks to a larger problem for the Ayatollahs. With their proxies in disarray and Netanyahu looking increasingly willing to escalate, it's become very difficult for Iran to avoid a full-scale conflict while maintaining an element of deterrence. So in this video, we're going to have a look at Iran's apparently unsolvable strategic dilemma and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's get straight into it. As we see it, the trouble for the Iranian regime is that they need to do two things at the same time. One, they need to avoid further escalation, and two, they need to maintain some sort of deterrence. So let's explain why Iran needs to avoid further escalation. We've done a full video on this before, but the TLDR is that the Iranian regime looks particularly weak at the moment. As we see it, the regime is dealing with three simultaneous crises: an economic crisis, a legitimacy crisis, and a looming succession crisis. Let's start with the economic crisis. Iran's economy has been in a bit of a state since really the 90s. What we might call the acute phase of Iran's economic crisis came in 2018. When Trump imposed what he called maximum pressure sanctions. These sanctions triggered a dramatic decline in Iran's oil exports, which fell from nearly 2 million barrels a day in 2017 to less than 500,000 barrels a day in 2020. They've since risen to about 1.5 million barrels, but this is still lower than pre-sanction levels, and most of this is sold to China at a hefty discount. Oil revenues typically make up about 50% of the national budget, so when they collapsed, the Ayatollahs had to find a way to close the fiscal gap, and decided to essentially just print money. Inflation duly spiked to around 50%, where it's been running for the past 5 years or so, causing the poverty rate to essentially double to over 30%. The IMF estimates Iran's GDP per capita is currently a little over $5,000, down from about $8,000 in 2011 and $11,000 in 1990. On to its legitimacy crisis. As recent protests have demonstrated, the Iranian regime is currently deeply unpopular with much of the Iranian public, in part because of their economic mismanagement. It's hard to gauge public opinion in Iran, but there's some evidence that many Iranians don't support the regime's foreign policy either. While the average Iranian might be keener on Hezbollah than Israel, they don't like the fact that their limited tax dollars are being spent supporting proxies rather than the impoverished Iranian public. And finally, the succession crisis. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is now 85 years old, but he's so far refused to nominate a deputy, and therefore has no obvious successor. President Ebrahim Raisi was a potential successor, but he obviously died in a helicopter crash a few months ago. And there have been some rumours that Khamenei is grooming his second son Mujtaba for the position. But this would be politically risky. Anyway, the point we're making here is that Iran is in no state to fight a war. Its economy is in a mess, there's little appetite for it, and the Ayatollahs are in a precarious position politically. Now, we should say that some people, including many Israeli politicians, disagree with this analysis and argue that Iran does indeed want a full-scale war with Israel. Proponents of this argument point to the magnitude of the recent missile attacks and dismiss the comments from Iranian officials about not wanting war as a diplomatic smokescreen. For what it's worth, we don't think this is entirely plausible. There's a half-truth here, in that this doesn't represent a fundamental change in Iranian foreign policy. Iran is still an Islamic theocracy, and death to America and death to Israel are still popular refrains in Iranian foreign policy. Rather, Iran doesn't want war right now for self-interested reasons, and we think its recent missile strikes can be understood as an attempt to maintain some sort of deterrence against Israel. In other words, a way of trying to tell Netanyahu to stop escalating without inviting a full-on war. Iran needs at least some deterrence both to discourage Israel from taking more direct action, but also because deterrence has always been a key part of the Ayatollah's so-called no peace, no war strategy, where Iran tries to undermine Israel and the West indirectly, using proxies and hybrid warfare, but avoid direct retribution by maintaining some sort of deterrence, i.e. by signalling to Israel and the West that if you hit back too hard or directly at us, we'll find a way to get you back. Unfortunately for the Ayatollahs, doing these two things simultaneously, avoiding further escalation while maintaining deterrence, currently looks impossible, at least in the short term. This is for at least two reasons. First, Iran's proxies have been significantly degraded. Hamas has lost a significant fraction of their forces in Gaza, Hezbollah's leadership has been decapitated, and American forces are currently escalating their attacks on the Houthis in Yemen. Proxies were a part of Iran's no peace, no war strategy because they allowed Iran to retaliate at arm's length. In other words, to escalate against Israel and the West indirectly. Now, if Iran wants to fight back, it has to do so directly. It can't just tell Hezbollah to fire a few missiles and stay out of the conflict itself. Second, Netanyahu has proven very willing to escalate against any Iranian response. In the past, there were always ways that Iran could retaliate that were strong enough to maintain deterrence, but weak enough to avoid an all-out war. Now, however, because Netanyahu has basically signalled that he will escalate against any Iranian response, the only response that would be weak enough to avoid further escalation and minimise the risk of a full-scale war would be to do basically nothing. But this obviously wouldn't maintain deterrence. So, what happens next? Well, if this analysis is correct and the international community can't find a way to stop the cycle of escalation, then Iran has a difficult decision to make. They can obviously either risk a full-on war or basically capitulate. Nonetheless, even if things don't look great for Iran, that's not to say that they look great for Israel. The odds of normalization with the Arab countries look increasingly slim, and the IDF has no long-term solution to either Gaza or southern Lebanon. Now, it seems that things in the Middle East might continue to escalate. Undoubtedly, whoever wins the US election could change the trajectory in the Middle East. And that's what our new Nebula original series, WTF USA, is all about.
WTF USA is our slightly tongue-in-cheek look at the US election. Each week, we dive into the online discourse, explain the politics behind the stories, and tell you if you really need to pay attention. For example, in recent episodes, we've talked about Trump's foray into the world of crypto, claims of dog eating, and AI-generated Musk memes. These might sound stupid, but they actually tell us a lot about the candidate's economic plans, the state of post-truth politics, and how the US feels about its deficit. That is to say, WTF USA brings you the wildest moments from the 2024 election, tells you the hidden political meaning behind each of them, and then if you can just ignore the chaos, or if you should follow along. New videos come out every Friday only on Nebula. That's the streaming service we've built alongside a bunch of our creator friends, and where you can find all kinds of superb content like WTF. We're super proud of WTF USA, and we hope that with your support, we'll be able to make other interesting, weird, and entertaining series with Nebula in the future. So signing up genuinely helps TLDR to grow and expand. As I say, it's not just WTF either. There's a whole bunch of other original content on the service, from creators like Real Life Law, Wendover Productions, and Neo. You can also watch every normal TLDR video ad-free on Nebula as well, and in some instances, before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, click the link in the description to get 40% off. That's just $30 for a year, or $2.50 a month. We really hope you check out the series, and as always, thanks for your support.